Welcome, everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. This week, we welcome back our regular guest, Kveldoffer Gunderson, and this week, we're going to talk about part 2 of Heathen Ritual. During the first program on this topic, which you can find in the archives, we did kind of a general overview of what Heathen Ritual is and a lot of the historical background. But tonight, we're going to talk more about the practical aspects, and I think I'm just going to turn it over to you, Kveldoffer.
Okay. Well, now talking about the practical aspects of Heathen Ritual, I think possibly the easiest way to do this is to go through the various items that were and the items that currently are most commonly used in Heathen Rituals, and talk about their background, what sort of materials are suitable, and so forth. As near as we can tell from the Norse sources, probably the central item of worship was a god image of some form or another. We have several references to what seems to have been the fairly common practice of carrying quite a small god image made out of a precious metal, or in Hallfreðr von Dretheskald's case, a tooth of some sort, probably a walrus or whale tooth, and these could be carried about with one in one's pouch, presumably so that one could contact and honor the god wherever one was. In more stable settings, in the context of a hoe for standing harrow, or even one's own hall, one would see much larger images. Very few of these have actually survived since they were made out of wood, but there are a few extant examples, such as the goddess figure from Denmark, which consisted of a tall forked tree branch with just a little bit of extra carving at the fork to emphasize the female nature of the god image. And she was actually found in a bog, having been very carefully wrapped and laid away. The best guess is that she represented possibly Nerthus or a similar goddess, and was brought out possibly as part of a procession, but for special occasions. We also have descriptions, such as the one in Gunnar's Stouter Helmings, of a Freyr image which was dressed up, went around in the procession with the priestess described as his wife, and was sufficiently imbued with the might of the god to stand up and wrestle with Gunnar, who won the fight, took its place, and it's recorded in the sagas that the Swedes were absolutely delighted when Freyr's wife came up pregnant. This actually is probably our oldest known Swede joke. But the point being, that the god image was not just, a symbolic thing. It was actually, considered to embody the god. Now we have a number of historical examples, of some of the smaller god images or possible god images surviving. It's difficult to tell for sure, as there is also the possibility with many of them that they could have been the king pieces of a Nepentafel game, or possibly that after the conversion, that was the cover story for keeping such an item. Again, this is speculation. That sort of thing wasn't much written down. It's hard to tell. Though one of the key elements of Hallfreðr von Dretheskald's story is that this was at the court of one of the Olafs after the forced conversion, and Hallfreðr was actually being accused of surreptitiously keeping this on him and thus continuing to practice the heathen ways. Now, the best known surviving pieces are the Thor image from Iceland. I think everyone's probably seen that. The little seated Thor holding what is apparently his an elaborate beard or his hammer or both, wearing a little pointy cap. There's also the very well-known Frere image from Sweden, which is believed to be a Frere image because it displays Frere's most characteristically prominent feature. There are also a number of less specific images of similar types surviving. The primary characteristics seem to be that the deity is almost always enthroned. They're usually done in quite a stylized or elaborate fashion. Although given that the surviving wooden images are often fairly crude and stylized, and we also have descriptions of posts with God's faces on them, fine detail of workmanship is not nearly as important as the piece itself and the connection with the god. And it's relatively easy to make a simple god image, simply a stick with a bit of carving on it to represent a face, or a few appropriate symbols and the like. One thing that heathens often today find difficult in setting up a hero with god images is that we do have relatively few surviving pieces. The vast majority of them are identified as probably being Thor, although there are some which are the one Frere piece and some which are suspected to have represented Odin. We're very, very short on small goddess pieces, although the recent discovery of a three-dimensional pendant showing a woman wearing a dress but carrying a sword and shield is, if it was in fact an amulet and not just something perhaps depicting a favorite character from a heroic story, and we don't have any way of telling, but if it was an amulet, it is most likely to have been either Skadi or possibly the family Idis's, such as Jarl Haukon's statues in his own hope of Thorgerder and Irpa, his family patrons.
Would there have been a little bit of crossover, though, between like an ancestor statuette like that and possibly a god image?
Well, yeah, I think not so much crossover as you can't say where one left off and the other began. Had it not been for the conversion, it's quite possible that with the enduring power of the Jarls of Flather, that the worship of Thorgerder and Irpa would have become more generally common up there in the north, up in Halogaland, where the Jarls of Flather ruled. So there is that. It's also when one is looking for an image of a god for whom there are no sort of nice clear surviving images, it's important to remember that our ancestors quite cheerfully directly stole any image from foreign culture that they looked at and thought seemed appropriate to their own. For instance, one of our most important groups of amulets, and one of the most widely spread and highly prized group, is the Bracteates, which are a large group of small stamped rounds of gold, often bearing runic inscriptions or distinctively religious or magical images. And the earliest Bracteates were taken directly from Roman coins. In fact, there's some of them, such as the Ungly Bracteate, I believe, where we can actually identify the specific coin that the Germanic maker was working from. But then the Germanic maker reinterpreted it in its own context. The Ungly Bracteate, for instance, shows the Roman wolf with Romulus and Remus on one side. The original coin had a female victory figure. The Germanic version turned it into a male figure with helmet and beard. And the inscription, apparently, is relevant to the wolf image. It refers to possibly the she-howler. And it's suspected that this was particularly an important image in the context of place and time, because the Anglo-Saxon dynasty of the Wolfings also had the wolf as their symbol or totem. So the image was actually being taken as it became a Germanic image.
Is that true of the what I think is called the Madrona statue that I've seen a lot of people have with the three goddess figures?
The Matroni statue is actually a different thing. That's a Germanicized Roman thing, or possibly Romanized Germanic thing, done in Roman style that was set up in Germany. And it was quite common from the other side, of course, for the Romans to simply slap their own names and titles on whatever native deities were available. But the very well-known image of the dancer with the two horns ending in bird heads also probably comes directly from a Roman image of the Roman image of the cornuti. It's not actually, may not have actually been originally Germanic, but it was something we took up, and it was an image that continued to endure through the Viking Age, probably in an amuletic context. We see this guy on the Torslunda helm plate matrices. It's probably closely associated with the cult of Odin.
I was going to ask, was there any? Do we have any idea of what it was associated with?
A very strong association. The Torslunda matrix shows the guy with the bird horns doing what seems to be some sort of weapons dance with the guy in a wolf skin. The horn dancer and the wolf skin guy also appear in the Kungsengen grave. In this case, they are two separate pendants, but the woman who owned them seemed to think that they belonged together.
Oh, is this the design that I used on your tunic?
Yes.
Because when I was looking at it closely, it also looked to me like the clothing was very pleated and very different from what I associate with clothing from that time period. And I wondered if it might have been something special or ritual.
Yeah, I don't know. There is one version of the guy found at Burka where he is wearing a long robe, though. And on one of the picture stones, we have what seems to be an Odinic sacrifice. You know, guy on a harrow, priest with a weapon, another guy hanging from a tree behind him, Valknut pointing at the harrow. And on that one, the priest is also wearing a long robe, whereas the warriors standing about are in tunics and breeches.
So actually there's a lot of depictions of this guy. It wasn't
Yeah,
just
there are a lot of depictions of this guy. He became a deeply rooted and very common motif, even though the original image was something we liked the looks of and borrowed. The upshot of which is that if you're having difficulty finding an historical image that you think is suitable from Scandinavia, there is no reason not to take something from a different culture or time that looks appropriate, that feels right to you, and to put a Germanic interpretation on it, to hallow it, call the deity to it, perhaps risk their name on it in rune staves, and in short, do exactly what one of our forebears would have done with such an item if they'd gotten hold of it.
So if you're trying to do things in a historical context, you might want to take something from a nearby culture or Roman. And if you're like me and you like to do modern as well as ancient, it's okay for me to use my 19th century picture of Saga because I think she's really cool and I like 19th century romantic drawings.
Exactly. If for instance, a migration age Scandinavian had gotten hold of, say, a statue of Hygeia with her cup or basin and her snake, it's quite possible that image could then have been used, say, for Air, assuming that she actually was known and worshipped that early. We don't know. We haven't got any evidence of her cult. Or any of the other goddesses associated with magical brewing, magical healing, what have you. Would do as well for Menglid and the ladies of Lufjaberg.
I also think that we could now start looking a little further than we might have even a few months ago, because the revelations that the beads found in one of the Bronze Age graves, one of the girls with the string skirts, was manufactured not just from the time of King Tut, but possibly by the same glassmaker. Means that not that they were trading directly with Egypt, but there was at least indirect trade going a very, very long distance.
Yeah, well, in the Bronze Age, there is actually a site found in Sweden which seems to have been a permanent, possibly Mycenaean or other Greek permanent trading outpost. There's a lot of interaction because, of course, bronze had to be imported from the south largely. We imported bronze and gold. We sent amber back. There's that whole trade route referred to as the Amber Road for that reason, because we were Europe's source of amber at the time. And there is considerable reason to suspect again that some of the Bronze Age imagery may have been influenced with our strong connections to the south at that time, particularly the imagery of the pitcher stones, which is most common in southern Sweden and Denmark, which is where most of this trade was happening, which was the gateway to the north.
So again, without being too eclectic, you take a image from the Greek world from that time, the way that they would have, and said, maybe it's meant to be Zeus, but to you it's Odin or Tyr, or if it's Mars.
Right, because that's exactly what our ancestors would have done. They get their hands on a nice god image brought up by our trading partners from the south, take a look at it, and basically decide who it is to us.
I think that will be a relief to a lot of people. And I would also point out, I think to a degree, it's a personal thing, but some people I know also enjoy fantasy art, even comic books occasionally. If that's what it speaks to you and it's between you and the god, it's still within that same paradigm. They use the popular culture of the day.
Exactly. Now, most people these days do prefer, where it's possible, to use pieces that are either very closely stylistically based on or reproductions of historical pieces, and the purpose for that, I think, is that one does feel that bit closer to the ancestors by using their own imagery directly. But in a lot of cases, that's not always possible because, well, only so much survived. So the god image then, whether it's the small portable version or whether, it's a 9-foot hunk of tree, is the one of the first elements that one should think of in regards to creating one's hero or holy space. Now, in modern practice, there's a sort of, I suppose, basic set of ritual tools, which the vast majority of Alcitruar do use to one degree or another, and that would really be the Tor's hammer, the horn or cup, but usually a horn, the blessing bowl, and the sprinkling twigs. Now, the bowl and sprinkling twigs are derived from the description of heathen worship in Erbygge Saga and I believe Hjalnasinga, where an animal's throat would be slit, the blood would go into the blessing bowl, be sprinkled around with the twigs, and eventually poured out on the ground for the gods. It's probably worth noting that while in the south, they had a friendlier environment, they tended to be able to actually offer large hunks of meat. We couldn't really afford to do that so easily in Scandinavia, but offering the blood actually was still offering a significant foodstuff. North Americans don't often think of blood as a significant foodstuff, but blood sausage, or what we call black pudding here in Ireland, was a fairly significant staple of the Icelandic diet. But anyway, the Thor's hammer, the use of a smallish sledgehammer or the like, seems to be a modern invention as far as ritual goes. It's normally used for some form of hallowing the space as the initial part of calling the gods and to presumably drive out any untoward wights that might be hanging around. Some people prefer to use Edward Thorson's hammer rite or my version of it, and as has been noted, these are not historical rites, and probably derive originally from the ceremonial lesser vanishing ritual of the pentagram. Now, it was often the case that a holy site would be temporarily or permanently hallowed, set apart in some ways. It might be marked out, for instance, with a ring of staves or other permanent markers. It's very, very likely that where this was not possible, that something was done at least to temporarily make a place vague, make it that set aside touching the other world part of holiness. So that's what we use the handheld Thor's hammer for today. It's probably not what our ancestors did, although we don't really know, because we do have one description of the hammer being used. Well, actually, we've got a couple of descriptions of the hammer being used directly for hallowing. In Thrimsfythe, it's mentioned that it should be set in the lap of the bride at a wedding. We see Thor swinging it over his goats to bring them back to life after they've been slaughtered and eaten. So if it's not an historical use, it's at least an appropriate one. Also, many people quite reasonably consider that since one of Thor's titles is Warder of the Vae, of the holy space, that it's particularly appropriate, regardless of what one is ritually doing with it, to have a representation of the hammer on the harrow. So that's the Thor's hammer. The horn is the next thing. Most people prefer to use horns for the historical sense. There's some suggestion that our forebears, even in the Heathen age, may have considered the horn to be a bit more special, a bit more ritually appropriate than a simple cup or chalice of any kind. For instance, the aurochs, massively decorated aurochs horn found at Sutton Hoo was, not only large and immensely decorated, but if I recall correctly, the aurochs was actually not present in England at the time. This horn had to be brought over.
I believe it was, because I think when I said this, I saw it in the museum. I think it had a note on that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure of it. So, the aurochs, of course, was an animal of terrific cultural significance to the continental Germanic peoples, and I think it would be very hard to interpret this horn as anything but a very ritually special piece. And of course, in the modern age, the horn is something that we all associate very strongly with the Viking Age. Now, they're kind of difficult for a lot of people to get hold of a suitable horn for drinking out of. There are a few people here and there occasionally who do make them and sell them with various degrees of decoration on them. It was also the case that the Germanic people on the continent were recognized by Roman glassmakers as a splendid new audience opportunity, and the practice of making glass horns was not too uncommon. Now, glass, of course, to our ancestors was a much rarer material than it is now. There are a number of examples where glass items, beads, even pieces of broken colored glass were used as amulets, burial elements, set in post holes. There were several glass beads put together with the cremated human bones and teeth in the harrow at the Ranheimhof. So a glass horn would obviously be something special, and I believe the Finnish glassmaker Iittala, Iitala, I think, Finnish, don't know it that well, makes or made a beautiful kind of crystal glass horn. I can't think of any other commercial manufacturers that do. But if you want to make an animal horn for yourself, the best thing to do, Tandy Leather, I believe, still sells horns either in a raw state or in a roughly cleaned and sanded down state. I would much recommend the latter unless you're good at carving with a Dremel tool or similar, because it's a lot of trouble to scrape off the outer coating. And you can take one of these horns, polish it to a fine, smooth glow with increasingly finer sandpaper and then jeweler's rouge, in order to render it safe to drink from. The simplest and most effective method I have found is to melt beeswax, pour it down, and swirl it about until the entire inside of the horn is coated. Some people use paraffin. I think beeswax gives a slightly better effect. The only thing about doing it this way is you can't leave it in a car all through a Texas summer afternoon, and you can't put hot drinks in it.
I was going to say, the teas taste really interesting. The other thing I was going to mention is I got one recently, and this is a source that I wouldn't have thought of in the past, but the internet makes it probably accessible to everybody. I got mine at the Museum Gift Shop in Copenhagen. So museum gift shops and probably online catalogs from any of the Nordic countries are probably another place to look.
So that is the horn. Now, since very few of us these days live on farms and butcher our own livestock, the original practice of slaughtering the animal, catching the blood and sprinkling it about, pouring it on harrow and earth and all that, most of us are not in a position where we can actually do that. So most modern heathens have replaced that with filling the horn with an alcoholic, usually alcoholic, sometimes other holy beverage, apple juice, water drawn from a holy spring, perhaps at a special time or time of year, or both. Even milk for particularly working with goddesses and housewives. Basically, any holy liquid can be put in the horn. Usually, the practice is to make toasts to the gods, either done by whoever's leading the ritual, sometimes done by means of passing it about so that everyone can make a toast in turn. Although this really doesn't work so well once you get over 30 people because it takes forever. But at any rate, after everyone has drunk, the contents are then poured into the bowl and treated as the blood was back in the day.
You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages. Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today? We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future.
The blessing bowl itself is probably the most thoroughly historically documented and consistent element of heathen ritual, as well as the Icelandic descriptions. For instance, it was common for Norwegians, and particularly post-conversion Norwegians, to refer to the Swedes as bowl lickers, referring to the fact that the Swedes seem to have been a bit more actively or possibly ostentatiously religious than their neighbors. The blessing bowl was really the central item, and one has a lot of choices in selecting one's own blessing bowl. There's nothing specific about the materials or size or appearance, so there are a wide range of choices. But if one wants to select a bowl to evoke the ancestors, to evoke a sense of historicity, the materials are something to look at. The most common material was probably soapstone, which is quite common in Scandinavia. In the Viking Age in particular, it was probably preferred to pottery. The Vikings were actually not very good potters. In fact, when I was on the Jarlshof dig in Shetland some years ago, Barbara Crawford, who supervised the dig, informed us that we would recognize when we got to the Viking Age layer by the appearance of grot pot, which was this rather substandard, gritty, nasty-looking Viking Age pottery. They just weren't good at it because they didn't have to be. They had soapstone. Ceramic certainly would not be out of line. They did use ceramics for many things. But depending on who you work with, how you see yourself, and what you feel like, soapstone is really appropriate, especially if you're one of the many people who kind of identifies with, the good salt of the earth, farming Carl, friend of Thor, free Icelandic aspect of our ancestral culture. If, on the other hand, one is looking for something more upper class, something more elaborate, there's a few different options. Metal, particularly, nicely worked metal, silver or copper, or bronze, something like that would be appropriate. Again, glass would be very appropriate because a nice glass bowl would have been a huge treasure. It would have been very, very much, Viking bling there. So glass is certainly, totally appropriate, and indeed quite powerful. As to the size, I recommend sizing the bowl to match your horn, or cup if you're using one, but presumably a horn. If it's a very large one, you're going to either want a large bowl or have a lot of people present at your rituals to drink it down before you pour the contents into the bowl at the end of the round.
Or have lots of napkins.
Yeah. Now the blessing twigs, they're referred to as hlauptein, and this means basically lot twigs, and we're not really exactly sure what was meant to be conveyed by that. It's been suggested that they might have been used at some point for some form of divination. I think it's unlikely that there were actually 16 each with a different rune stave carved on. Very unlikely that they were being used for anything like the probably totally non-historical method of runic divination by casting that we use now. But it's also possible that it's a general reference to weird, and otherwise your guess is probably as good as mine. But that's what they were called. They seem to have been significant. And the choice of twigs is something that one might want to take into account the deity or deities and the occasion for. There's of course, a great number of holy trees and plants. Some of the most important ones being juniper, birch, angelica, apple. I could go on forever, but it's it just depends, I suppose, on one's understanding of the main holy plants, and what one's doing. I've also occasionally used and known a lot of people who used leeks for the sprinkling, because of the immense amount of symbolism regarding the leek. But at any rate, we do know they had these, they were significant, and they used them for sprinkling.
So this would be like in, I know you haven't seen it, but in the somewhat well done, somewhat not so well done episode of the Vikings where they go to Uppsala, when the blind priest takes has a twig or something with branches on the end and puts it in a bowl and sprinkles people. This is what you're talking about.
That would be accurate.
I'm just trying to come up with things that sometimes people who might not have been able to go to a local ritual, so they might not have seen this, but they're likely to have watched it in the program. And that was one thing in that program that was accurate, although I would stress to people they probably don't want to use that as a basic manual on how to do a Viking ritual.
Yeah. Now, so some other aspects that were certainly used in folklore and early medical practice, at least among the Anglo-Saxons who actually wrote it down, the practice of burning, wouldn't exactly say incense, but the practice of smudging as a means of cleansing, driving out evil wights and such. About half of ye out there are probably cringing, going, "Oh God, no, how New Age, people running around with waving bunches of smoldering pine, pretending to be First Nations, blah, blah." Okay, well, just because other people do something doesn't mean we didn't. It doesn't mean we did either. But these things need to be looked at on their own merits. And it was a very well documented practice in Anglo-Saxon medicine to burn significant herbs and smoke the patients with them. Particularly, there's one description of dealing with elf sickness by burning a herb called elftona. There's some debate about what that herb was, but the best argument I have seen so far is for woody nightshade, which is also slightly hallucinogenic. And since elf sicknesses tend to be most often by way of psychological things, one can see the logic there. Juniper was the most commonly used item for smoking out ill wights, bad luck, what have you, in Scandinavia, particularly Norway. Sulfur, garlic, and a variety of other common warding herbs were often used, but juniper was the most common. There was also the practice, which is actually shared between the Germanic and Celtic peoples, of dealing with sickness in one's herds by burning a fire with particular herbs. A fairly common element is using 9 different types of wood, and driving the animals through the smoke, again, to cleanse them. So if one considers doing the hammer rite or something similar to be a bit too unhistorical for one's taste, well, I'm afraid that one's next alternative is smudging.
But you could, if you chose, particularly if you live in North America, use a sage stick, but you could also use juniper. Or one of the more traditional Northern European herbs. I mean, one would be reflecting of what was done in the lands where one is now living, and if you live in North America, or you're going back to the ancestors and using something European.
Yeah, exactly. In North America, one could make a pretty decent argument for using sage, cedar, and or tobacco in respect to those of the local whites with whom one wishes to be on good term, and because they have been proven effective against the local whites who are not so friendly to humans. However, juniper would be our main native cleansing herb. actually burning incense in the way that the southern cultures tended to do it, as a means of invoking a deity, raising might or whatsoever. That's not really anywhere near as certain. Pretty much all the references to smoking I've found have been by way of cleansing and driving out ill. There's no surviving suggestions that burning particularly plants was particularly pleasing to any given deity. I don't think it would be offensive, but it wasn't historically, as far as we know, a part of the practice.
Would part of this sometimes be appropriately done as steaming because they were using the sauna?
Yes, I was, in fact, just about to go there. That's a little bit harder to prove, but we know it was, for instance, a Sami custom to pour beer on hot rocks before their holy stones or sites, so that the alcohol would come up in a cloud. And by the way, if you do this in a sauna, this is a good way to get pretty drunk pretty quickly. Just a warning there. Although it is a very effective magical technique. I suspect that where we did it, it was probably secondary to influence from either the Sami or Suomi, who were most certainly doing a great deal of spiritual stuff with steam, and among the Suomi particularly in context of the sauna, where the steam coming up from the rocks is referred to by a word meaning roughly breath of life. It has often been suspected that some of the East Germanic tribes may have picked up the practice of the hemp sauna from the Scythians.
I was going to ask about that one, since it's now legal in Colorado and Washington, whether that was actually a tradition or just a folk story.
It's basically that. It's an extrapolation from the often fairly close cultural contact between the Scythians and the Germanic people. The fact that the Scythians were definitely doing it, and certainly hemp had probably two very important roles among the Germanic people, especially in the Viking Age. For instance, one of the Oseberg women was buried with some hemp seeds in a leather bag, a little amulet bag about her neck. And the importance of the hemp was probably partially because of its huge importance as a fiber plant, because flax is also seen as extremely magical in all sorts of ways. But it's reasonably likely that, given that it was used medicinally, that it was also occasionally used as a supplementary entheogen. Certainly, there was a great deal of contact between the Vikings and the Islamic world, where the medicinal uses of the plant were extremely well known.
So, I'm sorry, but could you define that big word you used?
Entheogen. A chemical used to aid one's communication or oneness with the gods. For instance, the primary Northern European entheogen is alcohol, but others may have included fly agaric from the Sami influence, possibly psilocybin, which grows pretty freely in Northern Europe, the Liberty Cap mushroom, and reasonably likely hemp.
Is this why Scandinavians put little mushrooms on their Yule trees?
Nobody knows.
But it is the same mushroom,
It
isn't
is
it?
that. Yeah, that's the fly agaric, and well, that's just one of those little mysteries.
That would be back to folklore then.
Yeah, it's been suggested that berserks use the fly agaric to attain the berserk stage, but there's a lot of reasons why that is incredibly unlikely. Starting with the fact that fly agaric actually, assuming it doesn't kill you in the process, creates much more of a mellow than a berserk feeling. We have several examples of people going berserk with no preparation, and often when they didn't want to. It's obviously, these guys were not taking this drug regularly. We have a lot of Icelandic berserks, and to the best of my knowledge, the stuff doesn't even grow in Iceland. So we can pretty much rule that particular belief right out.
So we got our tools. How does one go about constructing a ritual?
Okay, the crucial elements of the ritual are first probably in some way, either, as I said, physically or ritually marking off, hallowing the space one is using, which can be done with swinging the hammer about. It can be done with the use of the smudging or even possibly steaming. It could possibly be done by just standing there and calling on Thor to hallow the stead. Depends on how elaborate one is inclined to be.
But it is important, I gather, though, to sort of make a ritual space, especially if you don't have a dedicated ritual space.
I think it is. I think the indications, most of the references we have are to places that were permanently set aside. But I think it is very probable that where this was not possible, that temporary means were used.
So this isn't just a modern magical concept of some sort?
I don't believe so. Certainly the basic concept isn't. Probably the temporary use was being done. But of course harder to identify because a permanent steads were places people knew about. They were basically bigger deals. They were more likely to make it into the written materials.
Well, they wouldn't be the same hearth you'd be cooking your dinner on.
It might, depending on the situation. You'd get communal holy groves, holy steads, holy fields. For household use, it certainly would be the same hearth, but the hearth itself was also a holy place. The practice of making offerings to housewife or hearth figure continued in folklore well into the beginning of the 20th century. It was the central point of the home, and while it wasn't set aside to the other world, it was holy. It was a place where the other world melded with the Middlegarth. But I think you would go to the trouble to clean either with smoking, possibly steaming, or the Norwegian custom of putting juniper branches into one's wash water to clean the house. It's particularly done around the beginning of the Yule nights. So you would, so in some way you make your place special, or at least a bit more intensely holy than it is normally. So that's the first step. The second step, to the best of our guessage, unfortunately no heathen ritual scripts have survived, was probably an initial hail to the gods. And like most things, this can be done very, very simply, or very, very elaborately. But the fundamental idea is that, here you have prepared this space, and now you're inviting the gods to come in, to join the celebration, to join the kindred, and generally making them welcome. So you do that, and then the core practice, of course, was the animal offering, which, as I said, has, in most cases these days, for practical reasons, has to be replaced with the horn of holy drink, and the filling of the blessing bowl. And you would fill the horn. You would perhaps sign it with the hammer or Valknut or whatever sign is appropriate to whichever god you're calling on at any point. And that would be the point where you pretty much express what the purpose of the ritual is, whether it's a seasonal ritual and you're asking the gods' help to, bring a good harvest for the year, to ward you and teach you during the dark nights of winter at Yule, whatever the immediate purpose is. If it's not a seasonal ritual, then you're probably doing it for something specific. Say you're asking for the safety of a relative who's in the military overseas, or the safe delivery of a baby, anything of that ilk. And again, you would, while holding up the horn, address the appropriate deities or deities, and basically ask for what you want. And then you would go ahead and, drink, pass it about if appropriate, pour it into the bowl and take your blessing twigs, sprinkle whoever and whatever you're blessing, the environments, yourself, the participants, the harrow if you've got a harrow made up, and then pour it out for the gods. And when that is done, it's generally considered appropriate to say, thank you for coming, thank you for helping me, I appreciate you. There's various opinions as to how to proceed with the next step, because this is not like some other forms of magico-religious practice where, having dealt with whatever wight you're dealing with, it's also important to see the back of them go out the door safely. There's an Icelandic charm which is used for bidding the elves in at Yule, which I have found particularly appropriate to us, and it translates roughly as "come who wish to come, stay who wish to stay, fare who wish to fare, harmless to me and mine." And some variant of that, I usually actually say bringing weal to me and mine. But some version of that is very appropriate for conveying to the gods that, you love them, they are welcome, you're happy for their presence, and it's, the degree to which they stick around at any given point is up to them, really.
Most also true specific rituals I've been to, though, have a thing where they pass a horn around.
That's a totally modern thing. Completely 100% modern. My best guess at the moment is that it's derived from the Bardic Circle practice of science fiction conventions or something.
But when we're going to do it, would it be before or after the sprinkling?
It would be before the sprinkling. The normal practice when doing a modern ritual of that sort is for everyone to make their toast as the horn goes around, and what remains in the horn at the end of the round is then poured into the bowl, and the sprinkling follows only when all toasting and blessing around the horn has been made.
I just know that a lot of people are going to run into that when they go to their first ritual, and I know I myself was kind of, what are they doing? And then the fact that it was different between the different groups, and some people did it one way and another, and it was always presented as if this was a long established thing, and it
goes back to the 1970s at least.
Wow, it's still, it's 40 years.
Yeah, it's set in Alcatraz. It works really well. If you've got a smaller group, usually less than 30, it's not very sanitary, and personally I'd rather see someone coming about with a pitcher and filling up people's own vessels. That is kind of a problem. The individual filling of the individual vessels is much more historical and sanitary. But on the other hand, the positive sides to the passing the horn are that it's a good way to kind of bond the group together. It gives everyone, if you're doing a group ritual, the chance to honor their own favorite deities or qualities or heroes or whatever seems appropriate at the time. Since we have quite a lot of deities and most people tend to gravitate to one or a few of them more than others, it's also a good way to kind of make sure everyone that needs to be honored gets honored, particularly since some people are less friendly to specific gods. Some people are not comfortable toasting Loki, so it's probably a really good idea if there's somebody in the ring who is comfortable and is on good terms, so that he will show up in friendly wise rather than a repeat of Locusino, which none of us wants. Same with Odin. A lot of people are really frightened of Odin, and they should be. But there's always one suicidally brave person who feels the need to toast Odin. And if you have a lot of people with different approaches, pretty much good chances are good that everyone will get their mention. Otherwise, you might find yourself standing there reciting a list of god names until everyone else goes to sleep.
I was going to say, on a practical level, particularly if a group is starting and they're all kind of maybe starting sort of on the same level, what do you think of the practice I've seen in some, also true as well as pagan groups, if you come through the door and they hand you a script?
My feelings on it are mixed. It works for some people. There's a lot to be said when you've got new people, of making sure that they at least know the outline, that they at least have an idea of what's going on and preferably why. In smaller gatherings, it might be just as convenient for someone more experienced to explain it. There's certainly nothing wrong with doing the script, not least, sure, our ancestors wouldn't have done it, but they grew up doing it. They pretty much knew what to expect, and when somebody, the next village or country over did something a bit different, they were still working from in the water knowledge of the cultural context, and could be expected to respond appropriately. Whereas in modern Alcatraz, there are some things that want to be explained. I've heard stories, for instance, of newbies who might have mostly learned from fantasy books, coming into the circle and making a big toast to Fenrir, which most people would not really consider all that appropriate for a general Alcatraz ritual. Quite the contrary. Probably toasting any being that's got a really large and specific Heathen for the gods and is that strongly associated with the end of the world. That's really not such a good idea in a general ritual.
Yeah, I think the big one I've seen over and over again is, and not just always newbies, but it particularly happens with them, and you can't blame them, is when, as almost every Austrian ritual I've ever been to does this, let's get out the horn and toast, everybody, is tendency to start toasting everybody on behalf of the new person, because they don't know what to do. And they either just say, "Hail Thor," very quickly and pass the horn, or they do all 22 verses of a poem they wrote when they were 16, because they just don't know. And I think sometimes possibly giving a little talk, but a few guidelines, at least at the beginning, might be
really
helpful.
A good idea. There are some groups who exert, actually, and in some cases, quite an excessive control. For instance, on making vows. I think the excessive control comes from this silly idea that if one person makes a vow that they really shouldn't have made, that it will affect the weird of everyone involved, which, as far as I know, is a complete modern invention, slightly influenced by a scholar who wrote in the 1980s by the name of Paul Bauschatz. There's no suggestion that it was an issue for anyone but the person with the big mouth in the Viking Age.
Oh, so making vows or oaths could be part of a ritual?
Yes, making vows or oaths, it is quite often done in the process of passing the horn about. If you've got a vow or oath, it's a pretty good place to do it because, gods and humans, they're right there. You can say it in front of gods, humans, and weird. Now, there are a number of occasions in the literature where young men suffering from excess testosterone and possibly alcohol made really stupid vows that ended up getting themselves into a whole lot of trouble and frequently dead because they kind of overestimated their capabilities. And as I said, there's no suggestion that this ever backsplashed onto anyone else present at the ritual. But the advice that one should be careful with vows is a pretty good idea. And the practice of, possibly having at least a little bit of discussion with an experienced person, or having an option where someone can step in if the vow is clearly not something that someone should be vowing. The typical example is, say a young man gets up and says, well, I vow to marry this woman this year. That's not a vow he can make because he can't control whether she says yes or no. He can't make the vow for her, therefore he can't be even reasonably certain of fulfilling it unless she's already said yes. And he's just reaffirming that. So he shouldn't be making that particular vow. So the practice of having a moderator, the term some people use is Thule, after Unferth and Beowulf, though that's not exactly what Unferth is doing. But it seems to work. It's a reasonable approximation.
What about the custom I understand that some groups have of having newbies take certain oaths, like almost a beginner oath, and then later swearing troths to Asatru or the group or something? Does that have any basis in context of any kind?
No. The only basis that has in anything in would be either ceremonial magic, Wicca, or possibly Christian monastic vows. There's, of course, it's also in fairness, and I do see the logic behind it. It's totally not even conceptually historical, because historically you were born into the culture. You grew up knowing pretty much what you needed to know. You grew up as part of it. Maybe your family even had a patron deity like the Gloomers or Aelts. So there wouldn't have been any purpose. It would just be silliness and a needless degradation to voluntarily accept a position of effective subjugation. Our ancestors would have, I think, actively disapproved of the way some groups go about it, because who would voluntarily call themselves a thrall? On the other hand, in the modern context, we've got people who are coming in, really may not know a great deal at first, may not have any idea what they're doing, and I can really see the logic of, sort of at least designating someone for a little while as a trainee, hopefully with the appropriate attention paid to teaching them properly and moving them along, and slowly integrating them. But personally, I can't say that I like the idea at all.
And I can't recall any example in the lore, and I think there was one you would know it, where, say, someone coming in from the outside is either a thrall or a traitor or somebody who marries in, making vows to the old ones or something.
Not at all. Now, one type of ritual that Edred promoted in our troth, and that actually does have a certain logic to it, is the practice that some people refer to as heathening, where a new person joins the group, and in front of the group and the gods at Weird, they may or may not actively repudiate the White Christ. Edred's version had that, and Edred's version was basically a heathen reversal of the oath, I believe, from Charlemagne's time, in which converts were forced to specifically repudiate the heathen gods before taking up Christianity. Some people consider this appropriate. some don't. Our gods never seemed to care if you worshipped other gods or not, just as long as you gave them their due. But whether one includes that element or not, the idea is that you are ritually reversing the severance of the gods with your and the ancestral rights of your family that occurred when your ancestors converted to Christianity. We have one example in the sagas where the kinfilia, at the death of the eldest male member of the household, comes to the eldest son and says that she will follow him, and he rejects her because he's converted. Now she ends up going to the younger son, preserving the ancestral family linkage for a while longer. But we're basically all descended from converts. So I think there's a lot to be said for the ritual reestablishment of that link.
Yeah, I think it was kind of the formal the formal conversion that I was thinking of, as much as I realize there are groups that have very formal, you're a thrall and then you're a jarl or whatever, however that goes. But I wasn't so much thinking of them, but as basically both. But I'm glad you explained all the different ones, and the fact that that last one may have a little bit of history to it, almost, but really in reverse.
Yeah, the whole concept is basically reversing the thing that happened that shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, going back to perhaps what we would have been.
And the other thing is that, in the unlikely event that you could find somebody with absolutely zero, none, and no Germanic or Northern European genetics, and given how quickly and thoroughly human beings throughout the world interbred and spread their genes along, that's really jolly unlikely. But even could you find such a person, the ritual would presumably basically have the same effect of deliberately linking them with the Scandinavian spiritual ancestry. It would serve as an adoption, but then, as I said, there is the fact that we all need to be readopted because all of our ancestors.
I was going to say, I would be tempted to write an element of adoption in any of these.
Yeah, a lot of groups that do, because we have to remember that oath kindred was seen at pretty much the same level as blood kinship. It seems to have been just as spiritually valid, and it is something that we all need to do, should do, entirely appropriate for anyone, regardless of their physical ethnic origin.
Yeah, and again, to make that clear, the gods can call anybody, and the Germanic people were real big on adoption.
Yeah.
Not to mention, they seem to have gone everywhere from North America to China. So I think that maybe a few islands in there in Polynesia they didn't get to.
Yeah. But... Well, sure, they didn't seem to have any racial issues regarding who they slept with, adopted, made kids and married them off to whoever. No racial issues. Big class issues, mind.
Oh yeah.
You get characters like Melkorka, who's a captured thrall, doesn't speak, and eventually her owner, who's bought her as a concubine, basically manages to discover that she's, quote, the daughter of an Irish king, which probably meant that daddy had 5 cows, okay? But you also get, constantly these Suomi women who are daughters of Finnish kings, which is ridiculous because Finland never had anything even as impressive as the Irish kings, which weren't very. And if we'd been closer to Africa, we'd probably see, daughters of African kings in exactly the same position as Melkorka.
Well, they did make it to North Africa, so presumably there may have been a bit of that as well. Anyway, I just wanted to cover that little bit because that is always, and we brought this up in other shows, the question that people get asked so many times practicing Germanic religions was simply the misuse of it by some groups. You have been listening to our wonderful interview with Kveldoffer Gunderson. This conversation just sort of took on a life of its own and went on for about 3 hours. So I decided to split this into several shows. Tonight we had part 1. Stay tuned for parts 2 and 3. They'll be broadcast over the next several weeks and will be available in the archives so that if you want to, you can listen to them all at once or at your leisure. But for tonight, we're going to say thank you all for listening to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.